The quiet hum of conversation filled the common room of Liberty Veterans Home, a retirement facility tucked away in the outskirts of Dallas, Texas. The walls were lined with old black and white photographs, snapshots of history frozen in time. Medals, fading newspaper clippings, and yellowed letters sat in glass cases, silent witnesses to battles fought long ago. It was just another ordinary afternoon for the veterans inside, men who had once stood on the front lines of history but now spent their days in quiet reflection. Some played chess beneath the soft glow of overhead lights, while others sat by the window, watching the world move on without them. And then, the front doors opened. Donald Trump walked in, his presence both unexpected and unannounced. There were no cameras, no reporters, no entourage, just him, dressed in a crisp suit, moving through the halls with purpose. A few heads turned, curiosity flickering in their tired eyes. Some of the veterans nodded in recognition, others simply watched in silence. But Trump wasn't there to shake hands or make speeches. He was looking for someone. His footsteps echoed down the long hallway until he stopped in front of a door with a faded nameplate. The letters were worn, barely legible, but one name still stood clear. Colonel Henry Lawson. Inside, an elderly man sat by the window, the silver strands of his hair catching the soft afternoon light. Deep lines etched his face, marks left by time, loss, and memories too heavy to speak aloud. In his hands rested an old, yellowed envelope, its edges frayed, its seal unbroken. Trump knocked gently. "Colonel Lawson." The old man didn't turn. His voice was rough, weary. "If you're here to give a speech," he muttered, "I've heard enough of those." Trump pulled out a chair and sat across from him. His voice was steady, low. "I'm not here to talk," he said. "I'm here because of that letter." Colonel Henry Lawson kept his eyes fixed on the window, his grip tightening around the yellowed envelope in his hands. The old paper had softened with time, its edges frayed, its seal still intact, a relic of a past he had tried to forget. Trump leaned forward slightly, his tone calm but unwavering. "You've held on to that letter for 50 years, he said. "And you've never dared to open it." Henry exhaled slowly, his fingers tracing the outline of the envelope, as if feeling the weight of the years that had passed. Outside, a group of veterans played chess beneath a towering oak tree, their laughter distant, almost ghostly. "I was afraid," Henry admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid of what it might say. Afraid of what I'd find inside." He paused, his jaw tightening. "You know, I still see their faces at night. The ones who never came back." Trump nodded, his gaze steady. "But does carrying the silence make the weight any lighter?" The room fell into stillness. Henry hesitated, his weathered hands trembling as he carefully tore open the envelope. Inside was a folded piece of paper, its ink faded, but its words still clear. His breath caught as he began to read, his eyes scanning the letter. Then, he stopped. His face paled. His hands shook. "No, this can't be." Trump frowned, concern flickering across his face. "What is it?" Wordlessly, Henry handed him the letter. Trump's eyes moved quickly over the words, "A farewell from Captain Samuel Carter, a soldier once under Henry's command. A man presumed dead for decades." But at the bottom of the letter, a single sentence made Trump's breath catch. "If someone finds this letter, it means I'm still alive. I was captured. If you can, please find me." Trump looked up, locking eyes with Henry. "Do you believe this?" Henry's expression was a mix of shock and guilt, the weight of 50 years crashing down on him. His voice cracked. "They told me he was dead. I believed it. For 50 years. But if Samuel's alive..." He swallowed hard. "That means I left him behind." His voice broke. Trump reached across the table, placing a firm hand on Henry's shoulder. "The worst mistake isn't making one," he said, his voice resolute. It's doing nothing to make it right. Just then, a soft knock interrupted the moment. A young nurse stepped into the room, her expression gentle yet hesitant. "Excuse me," she said. "I couldn't help but overhear. You mentioned Samuel Carter." Henry's head snapped toward her. "Yes, why?" She hesitated, glancing at them both before continuing. "Yesterday, we admitted a new patient. He kept repeating that name." Trump and Henry exchanged a glance. Their hearts pounded. Could it be possible? Without another word, they stood, following the nurse down the hall. The hallway stretched long and silent, the only sound the rhythmic clicking of the nurse's shoes against the polished floor. Donald Trump and Colonel Henry Lawson walked side by side, their steps brisk, their hearts pounding with the weight of what they were about to discover. The air inside Liberty Veterans Home suddenly felt heavier, charged with something neither of them could name: hope, fear, disbelief. Could it really be him? The nurse stopped outside a dimly lit room. She hesitated for a moment before gently pushing the door open. Inside, lying motionless on a narrow bed, was a frail man with snow-white hair and sunken cheeks. His skin, once tanned from the battlefield sun, was now pale and thin, stretched over sharp bones. His eyes, clouded and distant, stared blankly at the ceiling as if still trapped in some forgotten place. Henry took a step forward, his breath caught in his throat. "Samuel." The man blinked slowly. His lips quivered. Then, barely above a whisper, he spoke. "Henry. Is that really you?" The room shrank around them, 50 years of silence collapsing in a single moment. Henry staggered closer, gripping the bed's rail for support. His voice trembled. "I thought you were gone." A faint, knowing smile touched Samuel Carter's lips, laced with sorrow and something deeper: forgiveness. "I thought the same about you." Henry's chest tightened, his mind reeling back to the war. The last time he had seen Samuel was in the chaos of battle, gunfire screaming through the jungle, the suffocating heat, the smoke curling around fallen bodies. Samuel had gone down. The reports later confirmed he was killed in action. But they had been wrong. Henry swallowed hard. "I left you behind." Samuel shook his head weakly. "No, Henry. War left us all behind." Trump, who had remained respectfully silent, finally spoke. "What happened to you?" Samuel's fingers twitched against the blanket, his voice weak but steady. "I was captured," he murmured. "They held me, years passed. I lost count. Then one day, a family, Vietnamese farmers, risked everything to hide me. They gave me food, shelter, saved my life." His gaze turned distant, lost in the echoes of the past. "I wanted to come home, but I had nothing. No one knew I was alive." Henry's hands clenched into fists. All these years, while he had returned home, carrying guilt and regret, Samuel had been trapped in a world that had forgotten him. Then, as if remembering something, Samuel's expression changed. Urgency flickered in his eyes. "Henry, listen to me. There are others." Henry stiffened. "Others?" Samuel nodded, his voice growing heavier. "3 men from our unit, they're still out there. No graves. No names. Their families are still waiting. Waiting in silence." A long pause settled in the room, thick with unspoken truths. Henry felt his stomach turn. His entire life, he had convinced himself that the war was over, that he had done all he could. But now, faced with the truth, he realized, it had never ended. Trump's gaze hardened. "Then we bring them back." Samuel exhaled shakily, as if finally allowing himself to believe it. "One of them." He hesitated, emotion creeping into his voice. Henry leaned in. "What is it?" Samuel swallowed hard. "One of them wasn't just a fellow soldier." His voice cracked. He was my younger brother. The words hit like a bullet. Henry froze. His throat tightened. Your brother, he echoed, barely able to say the words. Samuel nodded. No one knew. He was too young to enlist. He forged papers to join us. I promised our mother I'd bring him back. His voice broke. But I failed. Silence stretched between them, heavy, suffocating. Trump, always a man of action, broke it first. His voice was steady, unwavering. We're going to find them. All of them. The words weren't a question. They were a promise. The air inside the room was thick with unspoken emotions. Donald Trump stood near the window, arms crossed, staring out at the vast grounds of Liberty Veterans Home. The weight of what had just been revealed hung heavy in the space between them. Colonel Henry Lawson sat motionless, his hands trembling slightly as he processed Samuel Carter's words. His younger brother was one of the missing men. For 50 years, Henry had believed the war had taken everything from them. He had lived with the guilt of leaving his men behind, convincing himself there was nothing more he could have done. But now, sitting across from the very man he had thought was lost forever, he realized the war had never truly ended. Henry's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. Samuel, tell me everything. Where was your brother last seen? Samuel swallowed, his throat dry. It was our last mission before the ambush. His gaze drifted as if watching a scene play out in his mind. We were deep in the jungles of Cambodia. Our unit was ordered to hold position, but something went wrong. We were outnumbered, surrounded. He exhaled slowly. My brother, Michael, was with us. He was just a kid, Henry. A damn kid. But he fought like hell. Henry's jaw clenched. He had never known Michael was part of their unit. No one had. Samuel continued, his voice growing weaker. Then I went down. I don't remember much after that, just pain. Darkness. And then, nothing. They told me my brother was dead. But we never found his body. Henry leaned forward, his heartbeat drumming in his ears. You think he's still out there? Samuel's expression was grim. I don't know. But I do know this, if we don't try to find out, no one else will. A heavy silence settled between them. Trump, who had been listening intently, finally turned from the window. His voice was calm but carried the weight of certainty. Then we bring them back. Samuel's tired eyes flickered with something unexpected, hope. Henry's hands balled into fists. We made a promise before that mission, didn't we? His voice cracked slightly. If one of us went down, the others would bring him home. Samuel nodded, his expression unreadable. That promise has been waiting 50 years to be fulfilled. Trump moved closer, his tone firm. I know people. Military contacts, veteran organizations. If there's a way to find them, we'll find it. The fire in Henry's chest that had long since dimmed suddenly sparked to life. For decades, he had believed his war was over. But now, he saw the truth. His mission wasn't done. A soft knock at the door pulled them from the moment. The young nurse who had led them here earlier stood hesitantly in the doorway. Her eyes were filled with something more than curiosity, determination. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, her voice steady. But I heard what you were saying about the missing soldiers. I know an organization that specializes in recovering MIA servicemen. They work with the government, historians, even locals in former war zones. Trump's gaze sharpened. You can get in touch with them? She nodded. I can make a call today. Samuel's lips parted in silent disbelief. His weathered hands reached out, gently squeezing hers. Thank you. Truly. Henry let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It's time. Trump's voice was low but resolute. Not for the past. For the ones still waiting for answers. And with that, the mission began. Not just to recover the fallen, but to find peace, for themselves, for the families who never stopped waiting, and for the soldiers whose names had been left behind in silence for far too long. The decision had been made. Donald Trump, Colonel Henry Lawson, and Samuel Carter were no longer just reminiscing about the past, they were walking straight into it. Within days, Trump's contacts had set the wheels in motion. Calls were made, paperwork was expedited, and a specialized recovery team was assembled. This wasn't just another bureaucratic mission, this was personal. These men had been left behind for decades, their families waiting for news that never came. That wait was about to end. The briefing took place in a military facility in Honolulu, Hawaii. It was the closest U.S. base to their destination, a remote jungle in Cambodia, where Samuel and his brother had last been seen. A large map was spread across the table, marked with red circles and faded coordinates from an old declassified military report. A younger officer, Captain Mark Callahan, traced a gloved finger over the paper. This is where the last known radio contact was recorded. After that, the unit went dark. Henry studied the map, his stomach twisting with memories he had buried long ago. He had been there. He had survived. But not all of them had. Samuel leaned forward, his hands gripping the table. And this is where my brother disappeared. Trump, who had been standing silently at the head of the table, finally spoke. His voice was steady, unwavering. Then that's where we go. The room fell into a deep silence. Everyone present understood what this meant. They weren't traveling for themselves. They were journeying for the ones who could no longer walk this earth. The return to the battlefield. The heat was suffocating. The Cambodian jungle was dense, wild, unrelenting. Nature had reclaimed what had once been a battlefield. The thick canopy of trees stretched endlessly above them, the air heavy with humidity. Every step was slow, careful, the weight of their mission pressing down on them. Henry walked with quiet reverence, his boots sinking into the damp earth. He recognized this place. 50 years ago, this was chaos. The sounds of gunfire, the screams of the wounded, the sharp sting of sweat and blood, it all came rushing back. Samuel was right beside him, his breathing shallow. He had spent decades wondering, fearing, hoping. But now, he was here. Searching. A few feet ahead, one of the recovery specialists raised his hand. Over here. Everyone froze. Henry moved first, his heart hammering. As they reached the spot, they saw what had stopped the team in their tracks, a shallow depression in the ground, overgrown with wild grass. Nature had hidden it well, but this wasn't just earth. This was a resting place. With careful precision, the team began the slow, delicate process of excavation. Shovels moved gently, uncovering layer after layer of time itself. The jungle was eerily silent, as if holding its breath. Then, a glint of metal. Henry's breath caught in his throat. A dog tag, caked in dirt, but still intact. He knelt, his fingers trembling as he wiped away the grime. The name appeared, letter by letter, etched into the surface. Jonathan Carter. Samuel collapsed to his knees. His hands trembled as he reached out, gently tracing the engraved letters. His voice cracked. My brother, you waited so long. But I found you. I finally found you. The team stood silent. No words could capture the weight of this moment. Decades had passed, wars had been fought and forgotten, but here was a promise finally being kept. Trump placed a hand on Henry's shoulder. We're bringing them home. A discovery that changed everything. Just when they thought the mission had revealed all it could, Captain Callahan's voice cut through the stillness. Sir, we found something else. Henry turned, expecting more dog tags, maybe remnants of uniforms. But what Callahan held in his hands wasn't standard military issue. It was a silver lighter, dulled by time but still intact. Henry took it slowly, his fingers tracing the familiar engraving on its side. Return or die trying. His vision blurred. He knew this lighter. Because it was his. But how? Samuel noticed Henry's expression and frowned. Henry? What is it? Henry swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. This was mine. A hush fell over the team. Every pair of eyes locked onto him, waiting. Henry exhaled shakily. Back then, I was hit. I ordered my men to fall back. But Jonathan, he didn't listen. His hands clenched. He went back for me. He covered his face, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. For 50 years, he had believed he abandoned them. But now, he knew the truth. Jonathan hadn't been left behind. He had stayed behind, to save him. Samuel placed a firm hand on Henry's shoulder. You didn't abandon him, Henry. My brother chose what he believed was right. Trump's voice was steady, but warm. Heroism doesn't need an explanation. But remembrance? That's something we all owe. Silence. Then, slowly, Henry straightened. He wiped his eyes, his shoulders squaring. Because now, there was one last thing left to do. They were going to bring them home. The airport tarmac stretched before them, a solemn and sacred space where time seemed to stand still. The midday sun hung high over Arlington National Cemetery, casting long shadows as rows of uniformed soldiers stood at attention. In front of them, a military transport plane had just landed, its cargo far more precious than anything money could buy. Inside the plane, 3 flag-draped caskets rested in silence, carrying the remains of the fallen soldiers who had waited far too long to return home. Jonathan Carter. 2 of his brothers in arms. Names once lost to time, now finally remembered. Donald Trump, Colonel Henry Lawson, and Samuel Carter stood side by side, their gazes fixed on the caskets as the honor guard prepared to bring them down the ramp. There was no grand announcement, no speeches, just the quiet reverence of men who understood the weight of this moment. Samuel, leaning on his cane, exhaled shakily. You made it home, little brother. His voice wavered, but there was pride beneath the sorrow. Henry clenched his jaw, struggling to keep his composure. For 50 years, he had carried the weight of this loss. Now, standing here, he could finally let go. Trump, ever composed, stepped forward, placing a hand on Henry's shoulder. They fought for their country. The least we can do is make sure their sacrifice is honored. A lone bugler stepped forward, raising his instrument. The first melancholy notes of taps filled the air, piercing through the stillness like a whisper from the past. The sound wrapped around them, stirring something deep inside. Henry shut his eyes, letting the music take him back, to the jungle, to the battlefield, to the last time he had seen these men alive. He had spent decades believing he had failed them, but now, as their bodies were finally laid to rest on American soil, he understood. This was not failure. This was redemption. A farewell and a new beginning. After the final salute, the service concluded in silence. Families approached, accepting folded flags, symbols of sacrifice, of service, of lives given in the name of something greater than oneself. Henry and Samuel stood together as one of the officers handed Samuel the flag from his brother's casket. His fingers trembled as he took it, holding it close, as if grasping onto a piece of Jonathan that had been lost for so long. I'm sorry, Henry said suddenly, his voice rough. I should have kept my promise sooner. Samuel looked at him, his expression unreadable at first. Then, he shook his head. A promise kept late is still a promise kept. Those words struck deep. Nearby, a small boy tugged at Samuel's sleeve. It was his grandson, Ethan, no more than 8 or 9, his wide eyes filled with innocent curiosity. Grandpa, he whispered, looking up at the flag. Uncle Jonathan, he was a hero, wasn't he? Samuel crouched slowly, his knees creaking with age, but his expression was gentle. Yes, he was. He let out a breath, steadying himself. Not because he fought in a war, but because he stood up for the people he loved. That's what makes a hero. Ethan nodded, his small hands brushing the flag. He didn't fully understand yet, but someday he would. And that was enough. The final reflection. As the crowd dispersed, Trump, Henry, and Samuel walked away from the gravesite, their pace slow, their thoughts heavy. The sun was beginning to set, casting the sky in hues of deep orange and crimson, as if nature itself was saluting the fallen. Trump turned back for one last look. Tell this story, he said, almost to himself. Don't let it end today. Henry exhaled deeply, looking at Samuel. Do you think we did enough? Samuel's eyes were wet but steady. We did what was right. That's enough. And maybe, after 50 years of guilt and grief, Henry could finally believe that. A quiet understanding passed between the three men. War had taken so much from them, but today, they had taken something back. Redemption. Closure. Peace. They had brought their brothers home. And the world would remember. The sky over Arlington National Cemetery burned with hues of deep amber and violet as the last light of day faded into the horizon. The cool evening air carried the weight of something profound, something more than sorrow, more than remembrance. It was gratitude. Honor. Closure. A sea of uniformed soldiers, veterans, and grieving families stood in solemn formation as three flag-draped caskets rested upon their stands. These were not just caskets, they were symbols of promises made long ago, promises that had finally been kept. Among the crowd, Donald Trump, Colonel Henry Lawson, and Samuel Carter stood side by side, their faces etched with something deeper than grief. 50 years had passed since the war, yet in this moment, it felt as if no time had passed at all. The honor guard stepped forward, moving with precise discipline as they carefully lifted the first casket. Samuel's fingers trembled as he watched them carry his younger brother, Jonathan Carter, toward his final resting place. Trump's voice was low but firm. Today, we don't just bury soldiers. We bring home brothers. We fulfill a promise that was left unfinished for far too long. The words resonated through the gathering, not spoken for spectacle, but out of deep respect. Samuel exhaled shakily, clutching the folded flag that had been placed in his hands. You're home now, little brother, he whispered. A farewell that wasn't goodbye. The folded flag in Samuel's hands felt heavier than anything he had ever carried before. It was more than fabric, it was a lifetime of waiting, of hope, of grief. As he turned toward Henry, their eyes met, sharing the same unspoken pain. Henry swallowed hard. I should have done this sooner. I should have never let this take so long. Samuel studied him for a long moment before shaking his head. No, Henry. A promise kept late is still a promise kept. The word struck deep. Nearby, a small boy, Samuel's grandson, Ethan, tugged at his grandfather's sleeve. His voice was barely a whisper. Grandpa, was Uncle Jonathan a hero? Samuel's lips pressed into a thin line as he crouched slowly, his old knees groaning with the effort. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Yes, Ethan. He was. His voice was steady but laced with emotion. Not just because he fought in a war, but because he chose to stand up for the people he loved. That's what makes a hero. Ethan nodded, his small fingers brushing against the flag in Samuel's grasp. He didn't fully understand yet, but someday, he would. Henry wiped at his eyes before turning toward Trump. I carried guilt for half a century, but today, I can finally lift my head. Trump nodded. They never forgot each other, Henry. And we never forgot them. The honor guard finished their procession, stepping back in precision, their movements crisp and practiced. The final salute was given. And then, the lone bugler stepped forward. The first haunting notes of taps pierced the stillness, each sound carrying across the cemetery, wrapping around those present like a whisper from the past. Henry shut his eyes, letting the music take him back, to the jungle, to the battlefield, to the last time he had seen these men alive. He had spent decades believing he had failed them. But now, as their bodies were finally laid to rest on American soil, he understood. This was not failure. This was redemption. The weight of remembrance. The crowd remained in place long after the ceremony ended. There was no rush to leave. This moment wasn't just for the fallen, it was for those who had lived carrying their memory. As the last of the military officials shook hands with the families, Trump, Henry, and Samuel remained behind. The weight of their journey sat between them, unspoken but understood. Trump's gaze lingered on the gravestones stretching across the cemetery. "Tell this story," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Don't let it end today." Henry exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Do you think we did enough?" Samuel's tired but resolute eyes met his. "We did what was right. That's enough." Henry nodded slowly. For the first time in half a century, he finally believed it. A legacy that will live on. As the last light of day faded, Samuel turned toward the young nurse who had helped them connect with the recovery organization. Her name was Amy, and though she had only played a small role in this journey, it was enough to change everything. "Thank you," Samuel said, his voice heavy with gratitude. "If it weren't for you, I might never have known." Amy smiled, but there was something sad in her expression. "It's not just about finding them, sir. It's about making sure their stories live on." Trump, overhearing, gave a thoughtful nod. "You're right," he said. "We can't change the past. But we can make sure their sacrifices are never forgotten." Samuel's fingers traced the edges of the folded flag one last time before tucking it close to his chest. "They say a man dies twice," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "Once when his heart stops beating, and again when his name is spoken for the last time." Henry inhaled sharply, the meaning of those words hitting him in full force. Samuel looked back at the fresh graves before them. Jonathan won't die that second death. None of them will. Henry stood a little taller, his shoulders no longer burdened by the weight of regret. They had done what they came to do. They had brought their brothers home. And the world would remember. The cemetery had long emptied, yet Donald Trump, Colonel Henry Lawson, and Samuel Carter remained. The weight of the past hung in the air, thick and unyielding, but now, finally, it was joined by something else. Closure. The rows of white gravestones stretched before them, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. Somewhere in the distance, an American flag rustled in the breeze, its gentle flutters a quiet salute to those who had given everything. Samuel tightened his grip around the folded flag in his hands. His brother was home. After half a century of silence, of waiting, of never knowing, Jonathan Carter had finally been laid to rest where he belonged. He exhaled deeply, staring at the name carved into the headstone before him. 50 years, he murmured. "I thought I'd never find you." Henry placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "You never stopped looking." Samuel let out a quiet chuckle. "Stubbornness runs in the family." Henry smirked but didn't argue. The truth was, if it hadn't been for Samuel's persistence, for the small, tattered letter that had resurfaced after decades, they wouldn't be standing here now. Trump watched them both, silent but contemplative. He had witnessed a lot over the years, men rise and fall, promises made and broken. But this? This was different. This was proof that loyalty, brotherhood, and honor were not just words, they were legacies. And now, it was time to ensure that legacy lived on. A nation that remembers. The following week, a special ceremony was held at the White House. Not for political reasons, not for spectacle, but for something far greater: remembrance. Families of fallen soldiers were invited, their loved ones' names spoken aloud in reverence. Veterans, some with silver hair, others still young, stood together, bound by an unspoken understanding. Trump stood before them, the Presidential Medal of Freedom resting in his hands. He looked out at the gathered crowd, at Henry and Samuel sitting in the front row, at the younger soldiers who had come to pay their respects. He cleared his throat, then spoke. "We are here today because of a promise. A promise made in the depths of war, carried through decades of silence, and finally fulfilled not because it was easy, but because it was right." He turned toward Samuel. "There are those who say time erases everything. That we forget. But you, Colonel Lawson, and so many of our veterans have proven otherwise. You remind us that the ones who fight for this country are never truly gone, because we carry them with us." A hush settled over the room. Trump continued, his voice unwavering. "The greatest tragedy isn't in leaving this world. It's in being forgotten. And I promise you, your brother, and every soldier like him, will never be forgotten." He stepped forward, placing the medal in Samuel's hands. Samuel blinked, stunned. "Mr. President, I..." Trump held up a hand. "This isn't just for you. It's for Jonathan. It's for all the soldiers who waited too long to come home." Samuel's throat tightened. He swallowed hard, looking down at the medal, then back at the man who had made this moment possible. "Thank you," he finally whispered. Trump nodded. "No, thank you. A legacy that will never fade." That evening, Henry and Samuel sat side by side in the White House garden, the sounds of Washington, D.C. humming softly in the distance. Henry took a sip of his coffee, staring at the medal resting between them. "You ever think we'd end up here?" he asked. Samuel chuckled. "No. I figured I'd spend my last years in that retirement home, playing chess and wondering about the past." Henry nodded, then glanced at Samuel. "But we did it," he said softly. Samuel sighed, nodding. "Yeah. We did." A comfortable silence stretched between them, not the kind weighed down by regret, but one filled with something lighter. Something new. Then, Samuel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, weathered notebook. The edges were torn, the pages yellowed from time. He handed it to Henry. "I found this in Jonathan's things," he said. "Figured you should see it." Henry hesitated, then opened it. His breath caught as he read the words scrawled across the first page, written by a young soldier who had once believed his life had just begun. "If I don't make it back, don't waste your life blaming yourself. Do something good. Make sure no one else gets left behind." Henry let out a slow, shaky breath. "Your brother was a hell of a man," he said. Samuel smiled, the lines on his face softening. "Yeah. He was." They sat there for a while, the notebook resting between them, a quiet reminder that even in loss, there was purpose. And as the stars began to dot the night sky, Henry found himself smiling. Because for the first time in 50 years, he wasn't looking back. He was looking forward. There are moments in history that define us, not by the wars we fight, but by the promises we keep. A soldier's sacrifice is not just in the battle itself, but in the silence that follows. In the families left waiting. In the names carved into stone. In the unanswered letters, folded flags, and stories that risk fading with time. But what if we refuse to let them fade? What if we chose to remember? The journey of Colonel Henry Lawson and Samuel Carter was not just about bringing home the fallen. It was about something greater. It was about keeping faith in a promise that should have been lost to time. It was about proving that loyalty, brotherhood, and honor are not just words spoken in the heat of war, but legacies carried by those left behind. Too often, the world moves forward, leaving behind the echoes of the past. The names of those who gave everything become footnotes in history books, their stories reduced to statistics, their sacrifices swallowed by the passing of time. But a nation that forgets its heroes is a nation that loses its soul. We must be better than that. Because the greatest tragedy is not in dying. It is in being forgotten. That is why we tell these stories. Not because we seek to relive the pain, but because we refuse to let their memory vanish. Not because war itself is something to glorify, but because those who fought, who bled, who never came home, they deserve to be remembered. When Donald Trump, Henry, and Samuel stood in that cemetery, when they watched those caskets lowered into the earth, they weren't just honoring the past. They were shaping the future. They were sending a message that no soldier, no brother, no friend should ever be left behind, not in war, and not in memory. And so, the responsibility now falls to us. To remember. To tell their stories. To teach our children that the price of freedom is not paid once, but every day, in the sacrifices of those who came before us. Because in the end, a soldier dies twice. Once, when his heart stops beating. And again, when his name is spoken for the last time. Let us make sure that second death never comes. Let us remember. Let us honor. And let us keep our promises.